listening to the Academy Securities Geopolitical and Macro Strategy Podcast, brought to you by the Academy VETS ETF, a veteran impact ETF focused on providing market-based returns while investing in mortgage-backed and asset-backed securities that support veterans. VETS, with a Z, invests in residential mortgage loans to active duty service members and veterans, as well as loans to veteran-owned small businesses. To learn more, please visit academyetfs.com or contact your broker. The Academy VETS ETF is offered by Academy Asset Management, the asset management affiliate of Academy Securities, a registered broker-dealer. This podcast was recorded on May 8th, 2026. Brett Lowry is the moderator for today's episode, introducing the panel and leading the discussion.
Welcome to our latest Academy Securities Geopolitical and Macro Strategy Podcast. I'm your moderator, Brett Lowry, Head of Special Situations here at Academy Securities. Today I'm joined by General Spider Marks from our Geopolitical Intelligence Group and Peter Chur, our Head of Macro Strategy here at Academy Securities as well. On this podcast, we will cover the latest U.S. proposal to end the war with Iran and what comes next in the Strait of Hormuz. I will now turn it over to General Spider Marks, our Head of Geopolitical Strategy, to set the table and kick off the discussion on the next steps with Iran and where we go from here. Sir.
Hey, Brett. Good morning, everybody. I think the first thing we need to look at is where are we relative to the ceasefire and ask the question, is that fragile? I think it's fair to say that every historically, on a personal level and then through the arc of history, excuse me, every ceasefire has violations. And it's how you can acknowledge those violations, get your arms around those violations, and tamper them down. And in all cases, the amount of force that you have postured and what has been achieved in advance will allow you to state with a level of clarity that, yeah, you're going to have mistakes. There will be violations to the ceasefire, but we're going to be able to fence this thing in. It's not going to escalate to a larger strategic challenge. So in the case of Iran, I don't see that these ceasefire violations, we just saw U.S. Navy destroyers handling attacks by drones and also the fast mosquito boats, those Boston whalers that the Iranians are using to drop mines and disrupt and harass traffic as it tries to make its way through the straits. I think what we're seeing is all of that is being handled, as they say. I don't see that as precipitating a movement back to a resumption of the volume and velocity and severity of the attacks that we saw over the course of the first 7+ weeks of Epic Fury. I don't think we're going to see an Epic Fury 2 as this new phase of engagement. I think all indicators are that there are such immense economic pressures, and I'll certainly demur to Peter in that regard, but the economic pressures are now so front and center that the military application of force is now, I think, not obviated, but is relegated, but it will remain in place, certainly as an option going forward and an enforcement for the desire to have both business and economic results.
Thank you, sir. Peter, I'll pass to you for some of your economic impacts here as we go forward as well.
Yeah, markets seem to be fairly happy that we are still talking. I think the markets have accepted that there has been no major violation of the ceasefire. Markets kind of briefly blipped both when we announced Operation Freedom and then we took Operation Freedom off the table relatively quickly. But again, I think everyone's just focused right now that it seems that the U.S. really, really wants a deal. If anything, it seems like the U.S. has made more concessions on each, updated MOU than Iran has. And I think the market kind of believes that we will get to some sort of deal because Trump really does not want to go back to attacking for maybe some of the reasons Spider said, that we don't think we'll get much out of it, maybe because we don't want to lose any more people, maybe because we're worried about our stockpile of weapons. I still think there might be an opportunity as we've increased our troop, capacity over there, as some of the gig members have said, and we've had time to replenish our things, that maybe we go one more time if Iran doesn't move. But it feels like right now the market has decided Trump really wants a deal and will make enough concessions to get one.
Don't you think it's on the heels of that? Again, Peter, you have such a good insight on this. Trump and Xi are meeting next week. And I think President Trump wants to walk in the door, shake Xi's hand and say, hey, I got a deal. And he reaches into his pocket. He says, hey, I got a deal. And he shows him the 3x5 card that says I got a deal. I think that's a driving force. And I'm not Pollyannish about this, but I think there is some legitimate causality there.
Yeah, I think he's got that. I think he's feeling some pressure even within his own party that oil prices continue high. And, we're seeing oil, the front month is very volatile, but even today, as the front month contracts are coming down in price, December, January of next year continue to inch higher. So this higher for longer oil seems to be settling in, which again, oil in itself is bad because people have to go to the pump for gasoline, but it's the diesel, it's the cost through the entire system that goes. Once you hit diesel, that affects transportation, it affects agriculture. So I think there are a lot of reasons to try and normalize this as soon as possible. And there's still a lot of questions what normal even looks like. You have 2 months of supply kind of been sitting there on the water that has to transit somewhere. You've had damage to many of the systems, both in Iran, but outside of Iran. So normal, I think that people are starting to price in that a return to normal isn't going to be what it was before this war started. So there's a lot of moving parts. I do think people are kind of expecting some sort of clarity. Ultimately, and I think this is the hardest thing, and we're hearing more of it, and you talked about it probably the last podcast, maybe that we did not sell this well to the country, that I think if this had been sold well to the country, I think there would be a commitment to see this through to the end where nuclear weaponry is not a possibility for Iran, where their ability to threaten the region is not a possibility. And again, we've also talked, I think, Israel's goals might be different, but the Gulf states also may have different goals because they are in a little bit of a fragile situation right now, given their security concerns. Where do they get left in any deal?
Yeah, I think, you just segued to, I think, the topics certainly nested within the overriding strategic challenge, which is what do you do with the highly enriched uranium? Starting with the very practical question, where is it and how much do they have? And then how do you validate that? And how do you establish some type of a protocol going forward that ensures that there isn't recidivist behavior and they develop more as, they sign a deal, but they go back to their underground activity and behind the curtain, they continue the development process. That's number one, but nested within that is obviously we got to open the straits. That we got to get that door back open. Now, granted, it's open, but it's open for those that are willing to take the chance and kind of hug the coastline of Oman and get through. That is problem number one that needs to be addressed. And then I think the GCC status is critical. The Gulf Cooperation Council states realize that their security depends upon them going forward. They have forever embraced the United States presence. That I don't think is going to go away, but I think increasingly they're going to have a much larger and prominent voice in terms of what that looks like. And you may even see an alignment within the GCC. You may see, the UAE and Qatar probably view this a little bit differently. I think you might see an alignment that looks like some non-GCC nations, Turkey, NATO partner, maybe Turkey, Saudi, and maybe Pakistan and Qatar have an arrangement that says we can communicate with Iran. We have always been able to communicate with Iran. We have past history of that. We've got scar tissue. We have success. Maybe that becomes the grouping that embraces Iran and says, okay, moving forward, you're going to have legitimacy. You've always had sovereignty, but it's been a bizarre, strange, theocratic form of sovereignty that is becoming increasing, or has been for decades, intolerable. And then you've got this other alignment that would include Israel. It would be the UAE and Israel, maybe having a different view in terms of what that looks like. I think all of that is the opening to having a U.S. military presence that might not look too much different than it was before 28 February, but also responding to the pressures of these two separate groups in terms of what's going to happen with Iran. You're never going to have any type of an agreement that approximates even tolerance between Tehran and Jerusalem. That's not going to happen. So how do you then acknowledge that, but allow other players to moderate and be the buffer? And I think that's probably how we look at this thing moving forward. But you've got to have, as I've always described, the upper right corner of that whiteboard when you're trying to do your planning, you've got those issues that you must always address and circle back to. And those are HEU, highly enriched uranium, and then immediately, Straits of Hormuz are not in that upper right corner. It's in the smack dab middle of this board, and we got to solve that problem now.
No, absolutely. I mean, let's talk a little bit about the MOU that Iran's currently negotiating, or at least discussing, prior to coming back with their thoughts on it. Obviously planned for lifting the blockade in phases, which would allow traffic to start flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, because Iran would then loosen up their grip, during this 30-day period of discussions, if both parties, United States and Iran, via the Pakistani mediators, come to an understanding on this MOU. What are some other things that it discusses? Obviously, the highly enriched uranium and the Iranian Nuclear Program, and any kind of moratorium on time for enrichment. It started at 20 years. Well, first it started at never, then it came to 20. Now it's looking like 12 to 15. Things are starting to go in a direction where, could the Iranians deem this acceptable? And if they do, could we potentially as early as next week start to potentially phase back on the blockade to allow the strait to open while the discussions start to occur? Still deep divides, but Spider, past you for just your initial thoughts on where you think the Iranians are in their fractured state on coming to some kind of an understanding with us.
I think that the challenge that the Iranians have to struggle with, or maybe it's crystal clear and they're not going to struggle with it, that's why they're so dogmatic, is if they had a rather long, let's say double-figure breakout period for highly enriched uranium. In other words, they raise their hand and they say, we are a sovereign nation, irrespective of what the world thinks of us, because we have been a rogue, dangerous, exporting terrorism state for the last 50 years. So maybe that we got to shake that reputation. Are you kidding me? Of course you got to shake that reputation. Their concern is if they had a 10 to 15 year breakout period, their concern is when they internally look at their population and the discord and the distance that they have between the ruling body, the IRGC, and whatever happens to the theocracy and the population of Iran, is that 15 years a sufficient amount of time when they don't have the threat of a nuke and they have disruptive inspection protocols ongoing, have a routine presence where outside global forces are in there validating and ensuring compliance? Is that the period where you are now legitimately concerned about the flicker, the flame, and then the revolution that might occur over that 15 years? And what does the Iranian regime think global powers are going to do? What do they think the United States is going to do? What do they think Israel is going to do in terms of fomenting that during this interregnum where we've agreed to get along? I think that's their biggest concern about the highly enriched uranium. However, let's be frank, it's a red line for us and it's a red line for them. If we can agree that you can progress to that, they're going to have to balance, they're going to have to do the calculation. Can they maintain control over that period and not invite, or have the conditions are such that it invites some form of a crack and a fissure that leads to a collapse of the regime?
Absolutely.
Yeah, one thing I was just going to add into this, and Russia, Ukraine, Trump was very adamant about trying to get U.S. businesses there. Everything he talks about Greenland, there's a little bit of a business element. Venezuela, certainly one of the first things he did is get U.S. businesses that opportunity. So far, we haven't seen anything like that. So one wild card that I view is very positive. If any sort of deal, even if it has a delay or, it's maybe not quite as strong as we'd like, if there's an ability for U.S. companies to go in and invest in Iran and establish presence, maybe that's enough to offset that. If over 5 years, U.S. companies are there and involved, maybe that's enough influence to change how the regime thinks. Again, that I have not seen that on the table. It's not been a part of any of these MOUs, but it has been part of Trump's standard operating procedure. So I'd be really curious if something like that comes up at the last minute, where maybe that's the trade-off and we don't get as much as we'd like on some things, but we get this opportunity for American businesses. And then we would spin that, and I think to some degree rightfully so, that this is a form of changing the regime, allowing U.S. businesses. Again, I have not seen anything on that, but that would be the one kind of outlier that would not completely surprise me, and I think would be a positive surprise for markets.
Now, Peter, you've been saying that for quite some time. You've been positing that, and the president has been saying it as well. he has stated on a number of occasions, yeah, if anybody's going to charge money to get through the Straits of Hormuz, yeah, maybe, why don't we benefit from that? Why didn't Iran benefit from that? And you go, well, okay, let's put that to the side. But I mean, he has routinely, you've nailed it. We did it in Venezuela, of course. We did it in Russia, of course. We're going to do it in Ukraine, of course. We're going to do it in Greenland, of course. I mean, why wouldn't we do it in Iran?
So yeah, I'm hoping I'm right and we see something on that, because that to me would be that neat development. It plays very much into his TRIPCO strategy. So fingers crossed, maybe we see something like that. If we get a weaker deal, and maybe that's the concession Iran makes is, okay, we'll let some U.S. businesses in. And, that would be kind of our backdoor entry to kind of a regime change, not, directly, but our influence there would increase over time, which would hopefully have a positive influence.
Maybe this is complete la la land. I don't know. But Peter, could you see where the president says, okay, here's as part of the deal. I like the point that both you and Brett made earlier on, which is, markets like a deal, and they're going to want to have signatures on a deal, irrespective of our ability to enforce, follow, ensure, keep it within bounds, et cetera, and keep it going in the same direction with some momentum. Do you think there could be something that comes out of this that says, look, Iran, you're going to start pumping oil again, and you're going to need to get it out of the shadow fleets, sell it on the open market, have a nice day. And oh, by the way, you, Iran, invest in or invite the United States, invest in the United States to come in and start doing business with you. And we'll do that over the course of X number of years. Obviously, it's going to be a long horizon. Would you see something like that?
I could see it. Again, it's very, the two things Trump seems to enjoy most right now are oil, and behind that, rare earths and critical minerals. There is, by all talks I've heard from anyone kind of, in the, space, Iran is not only big in oil, they are potentially a huge resource for rare earths, critical minerals, right? They have a lot of undeveloped land. Again, all these countries that are very much focused on, almost criminal level or, nefarious leadership have underinvested in their country, underinvested in their people. I think that's why you have this opportunity in Venezuela. You have this opportunity probably in Russia and Ukraine, and you potentially have a similar opportunity in Iran. And it is the sort of thing that we truly need is to be truly competitive with China. Again, I don't know where China feels on any of this, and that could be an interesting development. But to me, it's so natural. It's almost surprising it hasn't come up. But maybe that's, again, the ace in the hole that Trump is holding in his cards, that, yeah, I'll give you a few other things, but you're going to give me this because that's really what I want.
Do you think Xi's going to look at Trump at some point in their discussion and say, hey, I'm on board with you. I think Iran's being a bit too draconian here. They're holding the world hostage. And guess what? China, feel like I'm being held hostage as well. I am not benefiting from their very aggressive behavior. And bear with me, I will overtly and openly support Iran's sovereignty and efforts to establish and remind the world that they are a sovereign nation, albeit they're a pain in the neck. He won't say that. But don't you think that Xi will step forward and say, look, I can get on board and quietly go to the leadership in Tehran and say, hey, guys, you got to be able to stop being this aggressive against the streets. That pressure must go away because your biggest client, me, I'm suffering right now.
Yeah, I could see that. And it's kind of very, everything I feel with the U.S. and China. So to me, something like this, China was better prepared than the U.S. for this war, better prepared than the rest of the world. They had 1 billion barrels of oil, but they're still not, completely set up. To me, they've been working on their electricity grid. So you see how much solar they have. So they're becoming less and less dependent on oil for their, own energy needs, but you do need it for plastics. You need it for chemicals. They do have a bunch of refiners who sell things on. So it's been helpful to their economy. So I could see them saying, hey, at this stage, China's kind of maybe had a small victory. Their economy hasn't been particularly disrupted because they had this huge, support. They've come across as kind of certainly not a peacemaker, but certainly not an aggressor. They haven't been really tied in any strong way to Iran's bad behavior. And if anything, they've kind of been, again, trying to pretend to be the voice of reason. I don't really believe they're the voice of reason, but I think they've done it. So it would make sense. Let things calm down now. China probably gained a little bit on the world stage when countries are looking at China versus the US. I think China's probably like, okay, they're behaving nicer maybe than the US. So they benefited a little bit. And then this lets them go back to work so that in 5 years, if this happens again, they really don't care what happens because they will have isolated themselves from that. So everything I think feel with China, whenever they sit down with us, we both walk away saying, haha, in 2 years, we're going to be in better shape than you. and I'm 100% confident China goes and puts a bunch of plans into work so that in 2 years they will be better than us. I think we come back from some of these meetings and we plan to do it, but sometimes we get sidetracked.
Do they really say, aha? That's an Inspector Clouseau. You got to. But I know you're absolutely correct. I think I like the way you framed it. Right now, China can say with confidence, yeah, we're in good shape. Strategically, they still have a significant gap. And you described what that gap looks like, and they're closing that gap. So they're okay right now, but they're very concerned that they're getting close to that horizon. If there's a deal, if they can work their way through it, it gives them buffer, an opportunity to correct it.
So that to me would feel like very, typical Chinese strategy, right? They've got what they could from this. They were prepared. They could go longer, but why not take a small win today and make sure you're prepared for going down the road? And then the other question, all of this, I don't know where this will play out, but I do feel Trump's maximalist strategy is losing some of its effect, right? I'm not sure how many times you can say you're going to bomb someone out of existence or you're going to end a civilization and then you don't even launch a single rocket. Like at some point, I don't know how all this plays out. It's, I feel a little bit, and I guess probably the opposite of the boy who cried wolf, but that same sort of feeling is coming through. Like, and markets have been pricing, quote unquote taco or Trump always chickens out. I don't think this is exactly what happened here, but I this kind of maximalist pressure seems to be losing some of its steam.
Yeah. And go, Spider.
No, I was just going to say real quickly. I mean, the real issue on all of this is that I think, at the strategic level, I think what the administration did on 28 February made sense. And we've talked about this, but we've just gone too far over the course of the last 2 months. I was talking with the senior CIA Iran analyst for 25 years. And he's published on this. He's lived this. And he and I would disagree. He's an absolutely gifted guy. And he said, we should not have done that. My point was, I think it was good we did that, but we established expectations that were never going to be met. That was the point. I think he and I coalesced and ended up at the same spot, that our expectations were way too overblown. And so the realization that, as Peter's so well described, maximalist pressure against an opponent is not always the best route to take, certainly, but it's one of the options in your kit bag. So use what you can, where you can, when you can, but realize that's not the only option you have and opportunity to make a difference.
Absolutely. And in shifting gears a little bit and just kind of thinking about, where we think this plays out to. If Iran were to agree to the MOU and negotiations begin, obviously our end goal here is to, take away the nuclear program, put a moratorium on enrichment, and obviously receive the high enriched uranium either back to the United States or, to a third party. Iran, seems to have substantial potential upside with the release of the sanctions. Substantial upside with the unfreezing of, upwards of $100 billion of assets. So when we talk about, obviously the carrots there, the stick being potential, further U.S. engagement, but we've seen over the last couple of days events that would, in many cases historically have said that is a violation of ceasefire. These aren't violations of ceasefire. We're definitely giving, putting a very high bar as to what an Iranian action would be that would trigger an end of the ceasefire. So I totally agree. I think it's effectively the United States is pushing in a direction where we want to see a deal happen. If the sanctions are let up on and Iran is able to pump and sell oil, hopefully at a market price, but even at a slight discount, but regardless, those sanctions are lifted and the economy starts to prosper either via sanctions being released or United States engagement on the economic front. And the quality of life starts to get better in Iran. Right? And we kind of move forward a couple of years, and then there's less of a, at least in their minds, less of a risk of revolution. But what are some of the things that are not going to be part of this deal? One, potentially the ballistic missile program. Now that manufacturing and, those facilities have been damaged or destroyed, but we know they can rebuild those. And Israel is not going to be happy about that program existence. Or is their ability to fund proxy groups? If money continues to flow back in when sanctions are released, there is a risk that some of that goes towards rebuilding Hezbollah, and supporting the Houthis. And Hamas, different story with obviously with the Gaza ceasefire and hopefully rebuilding occurring. But Spider, I'll pass to you for a sense of, and again, I don't want to cry wolf either on this one, but a little concern around, do we potentially put ourselves slightly in a position where we were in 2015, where those things started to occur and we didn't get exactly what we wanted out of it?
You set the table so nicely, Brett. Thank you. The major concern in my mind is if Iran is given an opportunity to march down a path toward trying to resume some normalcy and defining what that normal looks like, and there is an opportunity to kind of improve the life of the average citizen, and maybe the regime feels like they're consolidating power. They certainly have been. Their power has been diluted, significantly chaotic, but they kind of get that right. And that's an arcane, kind of inside thing that none of us really know quite well. But the key in all of that, the things that will not, the red lines that we've talked about, you mentioned, it's going to be, are they going to have a militarized nuke? Are they going to have ballistic missiles? Will they continue to foment and encourage and fund terrorism abroad through the proxies? Those are issues that we have to ensure can never grow to a level that is a threat regionally or globally. So we got to keep our eyes on that. So that's a significant effort on our part. But if in our effort to do that, the Iranians feel like they are so neutered in terms of providing their own and protecting their own security and embracing their sovereignty, then who do they go to ensure, who's their guarantor of that? Well, it's going to be Russia and China. So we have to acknowledge up front that this is an invitation for those nations to step forward and say, we got you. That is what I would call the triangulation of the focus in on Iran is, what will the United States, Iran, and China do to ensure that China doesn't come marching back in? And then the United States, Russia, and Iran to ensure that the Russians don't come marching back in. I think the relationship between Russia and China is sufficiently chaotic right now that's going to work itself out. So I think it really is the triangulation, as I described, is the path forward to ensure that Iran doesn't feel like it's naked and alone. Ergo, it's got to go to somebody else to get the support they need.
No, absolutely. And Peter, pass you for some of your thoughts as well. I mean, how is there a way, theoretically, for the United States to engage at a level economically with Iran? Maybe not tomorrow, but over the coming months, the coming years, where maybe we do get to a deal and we get most of what we want, at least enough of what we want to continue discussions, and we bring the carrier strike group in the region down to 1. I don't think we ever take it to 0, at least in the foreseeable future. But the economic opportunity we have with Iran, do we think there's a way for the United States to engage a level where there would be potentially less reliance on a Russia or China? Or do we think that is, unlikely to occur and those would be their benefactors, in perpetuity?
Well, it's a tricky one. I think from the military standpoint, it seems hard for them to wean themselves off of Russia in particular and China. They need some sort of weapon systems. They're going to feel that need. So I think they will work on that, but maybe they do diversify a little bit away from their economy. Maybe, again, this is the way they open it. They feel like they would be so reluctant. But as you pointed out, Brett, and I think Spider, and the one thing I probably learned more than anything at Academy is ceasefire doesn't mean what someone without a military experience thinks. Ceasefire, we seem to think, means there is no firing. As you guys have just explained, it means there's going to be some firing and people just decide to overlook it for the bigger picture. So maybe there is some way to work this in, and maybe it starts with some limited thing where it's more offshore. But and I think they're going to need Russia and Russia. Having said all that, Russia would not be my favorite, trustworthy ally at this point, given how much struggle they're having with Ukraine. And, it sounds like recently, again, Ukraine seems to be doing a very good job of embedding themselves into Europe. I really like the fact that they're putting a drone factory, or put a drone factory in the UK, that they've struck some sort of deal. I believe it was with UAE on drones. Like Ukraine, I think, is coming out of this very interesting. And Spider and I talked a lot about Poland the other day. Poland is, their GDP is growing, their power is growing. And, I think there's going to be a lot of counter influence against Russia, not necessarily dependent on US support of, Europe through this, more and more done domestically. And again, I think this whole kind of conversion to drones has been really interesting. Ukraine, Poland, places are doing a good job. So if I was a bad actor, I'd probably be tying myself closer to China than to Russia at this stage, just because I'm not sure where Russia's going to be 6 months or a year down the road.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. The pressure on Iran is significant. The economic situation there is dire. The ability of the United States to theoretically, even through the G summit, if we had to, and there's a chance that we will likely have to, continue the blockade at a level where it just continues the slow strangulation of the Iranian economy, at least from the export of oil. Could we continue this for the next several months? I think so. But I'll pass to you for just a force posture perspective. I mean, two carrier battle groups in the region, Lincoln and the Bush, two ARGs, the Tripoli, and then obviously the Boxer, which is not far away. 6 to 9 other destroyers that are, part of independent, deployers. So we've got a collection of assets in the region that could be there for months. Do we think we get to a point in the next 2 months, theoretically, if we're still arguing about what an MOU could even look like, or even we get past the MOU stage and we still don't get a deal and we still keep even a limited blockade in place? Is this something that the United States is, do you think, ready for, to basically say we're going to continue with the blockade for the next 2 or 3 months? And we did in Venezuela, right? We're doing it in Cuba. So it's not like we have no experience executing a naval blockade for a period of months. But, from a timing perspective, what's your thoughts on the ultimate timing here?
Yeah, it's the, I would call, limiting factor is the maintenance requirements of those ships. And all of those ships have their own individual maintenance tables and timelines that need to be met. Some of those maintenance requirements can be met OCONUS. They can go to a port wherever and meet some of those requirements. So that every ship captain, I would demur to you as your world, but they understand what those requirements are. So that's number one. And number two is the purse tempo, the personnel tempo. How long have those sailors and those Marines and those airmen been doing their jobs? Have they, are they reaching a level where they need to take rest and recuperation? They need to do some revalidation of skill sets. I mean, these are the normal kind of processes that a military organization must go through. And then you have the op tempo, the entire organizational's deployment posture. What does that look like? And so you have a horizon, and everybody knows what that looks like. And certainly you have muscle memory and you have established timelines. All of those can be stretched, and we know what that means. We've all personally been involved when we got the news that not so fast. We're not doing an about face and heading home or going from mission Alpha to mission Bravo. We're going to stay here and we're going to continue to drive on. So those are the big considerations. And certainly Iran has a vote in all of that. We're talking about what are the pressure points that we can apply? How do we think this is going to work out? And certainly we do it through the filter of how, it's action, reaction, and counteraction. So what is the reaction? What is our counteraction to what Iran is doing? And what have we missed? So certainly their actions can create a new cycle of determination on what our posture needs to look like. But I think going forward, the new normal in that region will be something that includes, as a matter of routine, a very large enhanced carrier strike group that gives the combatant commander those options, not only in terms of the naval and air continuation of a naval and air, maritime air campaign, or a new maritime air campaign that includes blockade, enhanced blockade, lifting the blockade, search and seizure, escort missions, and the ability to put boots ashore if required. That's a much larger presence than we have routinely had with a very short, what I would call readiness timeline posture. I mean, within days, all of that can be realized.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
Brett, I think you're spot on to be talking about needing this for months. I think the administration talked about within 2 to 3 weeks, the Iranian oil facilities would be blowing up or they'd have to turn them off and all these things. I've always been kind of suspicious on two fronts. One is I believe they probably have a lot more money stored up either in IOUs in China or various other countries, maybe through crypto, that they were not going to, fold economically within a week or 2 weeks, that it's going to take a month or 2 months, maybe even 3 months. And on the oil side of things, yeah, if they were running all their pipelines, all their production facilities at full steam, that happens. But two things have been going on in the region. It's not just Iran having to do this. They are all slowing down their oil production because they all face this risk, right? It's not just Iran that can't pump their oil away from the Saudis, open the pipeline that lets about 8 million barrels out. Everyone in the region has some of this. And then before they actually turn those things off, they're just going to dump a bunch of oil back into the sand. They do not really care, right? They are not going to risk their equipment. So I think all this talk that in 2 to 3 weeks they'll be on their knees economically, I think it's 2 to 3 months, and we have to be prepared for that. And the other thing, Spider, you did a great job, I think, describing the U.S. Military part of this. At some point, humanitarian needs start to weigh in on the whole region for food and other prospects. Again, China's mentioned a little bit of help there. I don't know whether they're truthful about that or whether they view that as a way they can slip some things through the side. But there will be a humanitarian issue in that region because they're also dependent on oil for their livelihood. And the GCC is struggling to some degree. And I think the longer you see this play out, the more pressure on them to create some sort of deal. So again, it just feels like everything we keep talking about is the right time frame is 2 to 4 months of intensive, work pressure. And I don't know, and then we'd probably get a really good result. I just don't know that we've done the pre-work and the prep work to go through that, struggle.
No, absolutely. And
I don't even just mean the U.S., I guess. I mean the globe. Like, as the globe, because I do think, like, if we could get rid of this as a real threat, the world would be a much, much better place.
No, 100%, 100%. And one of the points I want to touch on before we break, and Spider, I'll give you some of the last words. Israel is not going to stop. They obviously have a ceasefire in Lebanon. Hezbollah was not party to that ceasefire, but the answer is Israel is still targeting senior leadership like they did this week in Beirut, even though the ceasefire there is still holding as well. Some of your thoughts, Spider, as we close it up on just what we can expect with respect to the Israeli Hezbollah state of affairs. Do we think that the U.S. empowers Lebanon, maybe for the first time ever, to be really in a position to regulate and take some of the teeth out of Hezbollah, so they can effectively roll them back beyond the Litani River and reduce the threat to northern Israel, reduce the threat to Israel, period. But what are some of your thoughts on the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire and any complexities as you see going through the MOU discussions as well?
Yeah, I think they are not separate and distinct. I mean, it's easy to draw a line between what's happening between Israel and Hezbollah, the government of Lebanon, and what's happening in Tehran with the movement through Epic Fury and the ceasefire. I think with the thing we need to realize is the government of Lebanon and the government of Israel are working together to try to establish what their relationship is going forward. The challenge you laid out perfectly, which is Hezbollah as a presence embedded forever in the fabric of the governance in Lebanon. And how do you separate that? It's a cancerous type of analogy, quite frankly. How do you separate that? And what are the tools to do it? Israel certainly has a tool, and it's called a hammer. I don't know that there's much of the carrot and the stick. I don't know that there's much of an incentive on the part of the United States to help, but could possibly. So it really is, how do you shore up the relationship, the internal governance mechanism within Lebanon, separate from Hezbollah? That becomes a very, very tough task. But if the government of Lebanon feels strong enough, protected enough, and has the tools sufficiently to internally deal with Hezbollah, great. They've never done that. They've never thought about it. It's new to them, so they don't have the experience. Israel certainly can handle that part of it, but I think, to your point, the United States has a very strong role to play, but it needs to be in a support position, because Israel is the one who will ultimately and has forever paid for that soured and antagonistic and dangerous relationship that they've had to the north with Lebanon vis-a-vis the efforts with Hezbollah. So the United States can very much be a part of it, but it's got to be in a support position, not a lead position.
Gotcha. Well, thank you, Spider. And Peter, thank you so much. Thank you both for your time today. Wonderful discussion. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for your support of Academy Securities. We'll keep you posted on the latest events geopolitically and with respect to the macroeconomic environment with our sit reps around the world, T reports, and of course, our in-person and virtual engagement with you all. Thank you so much, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions to this conversation, and thank you to our listeners as well. Academy Securities is a service-disabled, veteran-owned investment bank with a social mission to hire, mentor, and train military veterans to develop careers in finance. If you would like to engage with our Geopolitical Intelligence Group directly, then please email us at info@academysecurities.com. I've been your host, Nicholas Carpenito, and we look forward to sharing with you again soon.